we've been talking about large issues that, as we've already seen from our first panel, which I thought was really excellent, they're large and complex issues, both about the issues themselves and the question of who decides. But at the same time, a important and significant body of work has been done over the last several years since this debate has really gotten going, but arguably stretching back decades. And we're privileged to have a group of experts who in various different ways have been involved very significantly with different dimensions of this work, nationally and internationally. And one of the things that I think is especially important is recognizing that there are a lot of different ways to do it. That what questions are the right questions is not given in advance, and that maybe we spend less time than we should asking what questions need asking, and possibly learning from different processes, different communities, different institutions that have asked different questions in different ways. And so the aim of this panel is to explore that, what these processes have been, how they have identified and approached the problems that they see as salient, and also the ways they have understood their work and their remit in relation to each other and in relation to the broader public, arguably in relation to the humanity whose future they will in one way or another affect. So I'm going to give just very brief introductions. I would like to refer you to the bios, the more extended bios that are on the website. First, I'll do this alphabetically. Dana Carroll, who is a member of the Innovative Genomics Institute and distinguished professor of biochemistry at the Utah School of Medicine. He is a pioneer in development and applications of an earlier version of genome editing, namely programmable zinc finger nucleases. And he currently sits on the International Commission on the Clinical Use of Human Germline Genome Editing, which was recently convened by the US National Academies and the Royal Society of the UK. Alta Charo is the Warren P. Knowles Professor of Law and Bioethics at the University of Wisconsin. She currently sits on the World Health Organization Advisory Committee on genome editing, development of genome editing standards and governance approaches. She also previously co-chaired the National Academy's Committee on Human Genome Editing, Science, Ethics, Governance. She was a member of the organizing committee of the second summit, not the first, I think. And actually, I mean, Alta's work stretches back decades in this domain, in salient related domains. It's sorry, but it's actually hard to think of more than a couple of committees in the U.S. that have addressed salient issues that she's not been on. Daphne Feinholz, who is unfortunately was unable to come here at the last minute, and so she's joining us remotely. Hi, Daphne. She is the chief of UNESCO's Bioethics and Ethics of Science section, which is UNESCO. This structure is one of the few formal standing intergovernmental organizations for engagement with issues of bioethics at the international level. Before moving to UNESCO, she played a variety of high-level roles in Mexican biomedicine and bioethics, including Director for Research and Planning of the Women and Health Program of the Mexican Ministry of Health, and Executive Director of the National Commission of Bioethics in Mexico. And she was Mexico's representative to the International Bioethics Committee of UNESCO during the drafting of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. Laurence Leboeuf is the head of the Bioethics Unit and Secretary of the Committee on Bioethics, which is the intergovernmental committee in charge of the activities on the protection of human rights in biomedicine. This is at the Council of Europe. She's been involved with a huge range of different issues in biomedicine and biotechnology in her work there at the Council of Europe, including in particular activities on human genetics and on the protection of the human embryo and fetus, and genetic testing for health purposes. And as if her portfolio of issues was not diverse and complex enough, she is responsible for, in effect, convening and managing the conversations of delegates from a large number of European and actually other countries around these complex issues. And finally, Nora Schultz is research officer with the German Ethics Council, and she's also a freelance science writer. And her work at the German Ethics Council, which is based in Berlin, has covered topics from genetic diagnosis and stem cell research to biosecurity, brain death, and big data. She most recently coordinated the German Ethics Council's 3-year program on genome editing and human reproduction, which recently culminated in the report Intervening in the Human Germline, which was published last May, and I encourage you all to take a look at. So we are going to run this as a conversation, and I want to begin by inviting our panelists to say a few words, first of all, of introduction about the organization or organizations they are sort of here speaking about, though I should say not officially representing. Certainly in Daphna's case, and I think probably in all the rest of you are happy to have that disclaimer as well. So speaking about the organization or organizations that they have been doing work in, but also the way those organizations have identified the key questions that they see as needing their attention and understood their remit and responsibility, particularly in relation to the larger questions of how this technology should be governed and by whom. So, Laurence, I'd like to begin with you, since the framework that you have been doing your recent work in is arguably the most long-standing of those that the panelists have been engaged with.
Well, thanks, and thanks for this invitation. So you asked me to say a few words about the history of the Council of Europe, maybe just to remind you what this organization is about. Kealu mentioned about history making us. I think Council of Europe is based on history. And this is an organization that is composed of 47 European states. So the geographical scope is quite large. It goes from include Georgia and Iceland and Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, including all the 28, or sorry, for those who are Brits, maybe 27 soon, member of the European Union. These organizations were set up in 1949 with a mandate which is focusing on the promotions of human rights. And here, I think the most famous body of the Council of Europe is the European Court of Human Rights, but also promoting democracy and the rule of law. And it's within this pillar and this missions of protection of human rights that the Council of Europe at the beginning of the 80s start looking more precisely at the protection of human rights in the field of biomedicines. And this was very much linked to the evolutions of the practices and technology in this field, which together with being very promising for the health benefit in particular, were also raising concerns because it enabled to have a greater control on human life. And the concerns were linked to the possible misuse and abuses linked to those possibilities. And I think that's important to underline that for the Council of Europe, there was always the idea that progress and protection of human rights were working in synergy. In other words, progress in the real sense of the words were closely linked to the fact that you could make sure that human rights are protected, and you are really promoting the applications of those developments that are really beneficial for individuals, human individuals, but also our societies. And it's with that kind of concern that this work, which started in the 80s, ended up with the adoptions of what is currently the only legally binding instrument at international level, protecting human rights in biomedical field, which is the Convention on Human Rights in Biomedicines, very often referred to as the Oviedo Conventions because it was open for signature in Oviedo in Spain in 1997. And these conventions lay down fundamental principles for the protection of human rights in biomedicines. Most of these applications are dealing with patient rights issues, but some are more targeting a specific field of biomedicine, which is transplantation, genetics, and research. And I'm not going to go further into this, but just to highlight that there are two provisions in this convention that are particularly relevant for the topics today. One concerned intervention on the human genome, because as Kealu was mentioning, this is not only with CRISPR that these questions came in. At the time the convention was elaborated, we had the talent and the zinc finger technology already. And there were a certain concern that led to the adoptions of a provisions that is limiting the purposes for which intervention on human genomes could be possible and prohibiting interventions aiming at passing on the mutations or the changes to future generations. So we could discuss that further. And the second provision, which to me is even more important, concerns public debate. Because 20 years ago already, there was an acknowledgement that all those issues concerned the whole society. And it was particularly important that not only states and authority promote public debate, but that they are also consulting the opinions with a view to make policy decisions. And I think that's particularly important in the current context today. So quickly, where we stand now, we celebrated 2 years ago the 20th anniversary of that convention. And celebration is nice, but have a prospective approach is even better, just to assess, because the drafters were very much aware that they were looking at a field that was constantly evolving, and that it was important to regularly re-examine the evolution of the biomedical field to assess whether the provision laid down continued to be relevant. And the conclusions of that examinations were indeed, they are relevant and they are reference. We could again discuss further what being a reference means, but this led also to prospective work, which led to the future adoption of a strategic action plan on human rights and technologies, one pillar of which is focusing on governance. And two elements came up as an outcome of the discussion on this governance issue. First, that we need a new model of governance, where ethics and human rights are guiding any use of genome editing applications. So we want to embed human rights in technology, and that in the new model of governance, societal discussions are key elements. And here again, I guess we could discuss further what it means precisely. So that's so much for my introduction.
So maybe, Alta, maybe I'll invite you to pick up there, since you chaired an organization, or you chaired a body that offered a set of principles for how to think about governance, particularly at the international level. I wonder if you'd say a few words about those principles and how you approach them.
Sure. So very briefly, I want to walk through this chronologically. I think it may be easier. Sure. My first introduction to the field was in 2015, when Jennifer Doudna organized a very small group, and it did not involve members of the public, to meet in Napa to discuss the potential implications of her now emerging work in the area of CRISPR. And notably, she invited David Baltimore and Paul Berg, who had been part of what has now become a kind of famous event, the Asilomar conference back in the 70s, which was a gathering primarily of scientists to discuss what kind of self-regulation they should engage in the earliest stages of recombinant DNA work, where there were a lot of concerns about potential environmental effects. And what's interesting about Asilomar that you need to keep in mind is that those approaches became influential, but not determinative of what became the approach in the United States at the policy and legislative level. That took place through the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and then through the Congress. And so it was an example of watching how scientists and their approaches can influence but can't determine what will be the outcome. Because by then, you've actually got a much broader public involvement when you get into legislation. And I was interested when you were talking in your questions to people about forms of public engagement that you didn't include voting, which would seem to be the most direct form, however frustrating it may be. The next was then, as a result of this particular small meeting, the decision to have a broader initiative, the Genome Initiative at the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Medicine in the US. And that was something that was a collaborative effort with the UK's Royal Society and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. And the Genome Initiative had two functions. One was to create this international summit, which you had mentioned, the end of 2015, where we really had the first kind of major international meeting to kind of look at where the science is and very briefly look at where the laws are and what the societal implications might be. Second part of that initiative was this report, this consensus study that took, I don't know, 19 months? No, not quite. About a year and 2 months to get done, which came out with recommendations. And I want to just say very briefly that the report was done by a committee that was multinational. We had people, we've got our French representative sitting in the audience here, Jennifer Merchant, but we had people from Egypt and Israel, and we had people who were originally from Spain and from Italy and from Germany who were sitting on the committee, and other countries as well, Canada, et cetera. But we had two different tasks. One was to make a set of recommendations to the US government in particular. And so in that sense, those parts of our study were constrained by US constitutional law and frankly by US politics. And so it focused on the role of the Food and Drug Administration, and it looked primarily at the things the FDA is allowed to look at, which is risks and benefits. They are not supposed to look at whether or not people think this is anti-religious or otherwise immoral. They have a much more technical remit. The second was to outline these grand principes that everybody in the world could use. And so, of course, they become extremely general and very mom and apple pie. But still, the idea was any government that's going to look at this, whatever your policy turns out to be, should answer to those principles. And some of them are very similar to what you saw earlier, the idea of respect for persons, responsible science, due care for patients, promoting well-being generally, transparency. These are the kinds of things that we thought a wide variety of policies, whether they are prohibitory or permissive, could answer to. But you need to figure out how your policy is going to work within those approaches and make sure that you're not being unduly disrespectful of people's personal choices or unduly insensitive to differential access to technologies and other kinds of things. This was an expert committee that did have somebody who represented rare disease groups, but it did not attempt to involve the general public, although anybody was welcome to send in comments, and there were many people who came to speak to us, including people who represented a wide variety of patient groups. Because it was understood that this was advisory, and it was only one step toward what would then become a more political endeavor. And so there was no sense that every expert committee had to be one that answered to the entire public, because it was only one piece of a kind of multi-sectorial approach to these problems. The Hong Kong summit was another activity that, again, used experts for the organizing committee, and really, again, was not about generating wide public engagement for the sake of kind of deliberative democracy. It was about getting an update on where the science is, because it was moving so fast, and where are the policy and legal developments around the world. So a kind of survey and some amount of discussion about public attitudes, but not an attempt in any way to be representative. Again, nothing out of these summits, even with their statements about societal consensus or the statement that came out of our second summit, which represented only the views of the organizers, not of any agency or organization, which called for a responsible approach to this, in particular for germline, to recognize that there's going to be different approaches. Some countries will permit it or will fail to prohibit it. And we need to have some guidance for the kind of preclinical research needed to ever make this technically responsible, even if you might still disagree with its morality. And then the last is this World Health Organization committee, which is really complementary to the one that Dana Carroll is on. One of the things that came out of the Hong Kong summit was the recognition that there's really two interlocking but distinct issues. One is the technical problems. How do we know when we know enough to move on to the next step, whether it's in laboratory research or in clinical care inducing a pregnancy? How do regulators get the information they need in order to know how to evaluate risks and benefits? And so a committee that has primarily been guided by the US and UK societies and also the Inter-Academy Partnership is looking at that. Certainly there are ethical issues embedded in that. What is safe is really a relative question. Safe enough depending on what you're trying to condition you're trying to prevent. So you can't get away from ethics completely, but primarily we're hoping is technical. World Health Organization, which has representatives from every continent, was designed to try and look at principles for governance. The first thing that this committee has done is to call for a registry so that we know what's being done around the world. The idea is good ethics and good governance begins with good facts, and we had no idea who was doing what and where. So a registry, which has a million little problems in terms of implementation we can talk about, is the first. The second is going to be to try to be a little bit more precise in some of the principles for governance. Let's say you've got a country that's going to prohibit something. What should they be aware of? Like, what happens if one of their citizens goes to a country where it's permitted, or their scientist goes? What happens when they come back? If you're going to permit it, how do you make sure you don't become what some people call a risk haven, where people from less permissive countries are flooding to you because you're simply allowing everything to happen? So there's kind of governance issues that need some systematic attention, even understanding that different domestic governments are going to make their own choices. I just want to conclude with one very brief brief anecdote, and has to do with something I worked on before you made the point that I'm about 97 years old.
You've accomplished a lot in a short time.
Yeah, nice catch. Human embryonic stem cell research. And I noticed that in one of the answers, somebody took on Worf and Jamie Thompson in particular. So when human embryonic stem cell research was being debated in the US government, it was very controversial because of its interplay with the abortion debate. We had an expert committee at the National Academies that I co-chaired with the same co-chair I had for the Genome Editing Committee, a wonderful scientist at MIT named Richard Hines. And we came out with all kinds of recommendations for what should be funded and what kinds of experiments were too dangerous to do. But they were advisory. And that's all they were. They were just advisory. What happened next? We had hearings in Congress where you now had a broader set of people offering up their voices. Christopher Reeve became famous after he was paralyzed for supporting this kind of work. We also had people who were arguing against it. And the most amazing thing, though, which really told me how the public does, in fact, have an influence, was when I was sitting with Orrin Hatch, who was the senator from Utah, very conservative Republican, whom you would expect to be opposed to anything that smacks of supporting abortion rights or not acknowledging the sacredness of the earliest forms of human life. And he said that he had been opposed to all of this kind of embryonic stem cell research because it killed embryos, except that he had a constituent who come into his office with her son, who was in a wheelchair, who said, "How can you vote against research that might help my son walk one day?" Now, frankly, the research was unlikely to let her son walk one day. He probably had lost enough function at this point that he was no longer really treatable. But nonetheless, it was so profoundly important to Hatch that he wound up changing his vote and supporting funding for this research, and really began to bring along with him a whole host of people in the Republican Party, so that we now had bills that were co-sponsored by Mike Castle, a Republican, and Diane DeGette from Colorado, who's a Democrat. And ultimately, eventually, we did wind up with funding. So I see public participation as coming in from many different avenues outside of expert committees, which then are complementary to public participation. And it's why I feel comfortable serving on the expert committees without making them kind of the democracy of the wolves and sheep that were mentioned earlier. Thanks.
Thanks, Alta. So your comment raised, issues of representation, I think, which are very crucial issues. So the question of who stands in for whom on one level, but also who represents what's at stake, and the ways in which those representations then maybe take on a life of their own. And actually, the advisory statement about stem cell research governance is instructive in the sense that it has in fact been taken up and implemented as a kind of quasi-codified regulatory structure, whether or not that was intended in the development of those recommendations or guidelines in the first place. So it's simply worth noting the ways in which representations of issues that come out of even simply advisory processes do have important effects upon governance. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn to Daphna, who is responsible for a division of a international organization in which questions of representation, of course, are key, yet perhaps approached in a somewhat different way than they were approached for example, in the expert committees that Alta was part of. So Daphna, I wonder if you would just say a quick word about the IBC, and also about how you have approached issues in this domain, and in particular, what prior work of the UNESCO's they've drawn upon vis-a-vis issues of human dignity and human rights.
Hi, Ben, and hi, everybody. Thank you very much for this kind invitation. First of all, even if I'm not speaking officially now on behalf of UNESCO, I will share all the information about what UNESCO does. And also thank you very much for having me remotely, because unfortunately last minute health issue was the reason why I couldn't join. And I have to say that I'm also having a lot of problem listening, and I'm not following properly what's being discussed in the room. Here your colleague has been very nice, and she has transcribed the chat. She says that which representation issues are key but approached differently than expert committees. Please say something about IDC and how you've approached this and what prior UNESCO work you've been drawn up. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, okay, so before I joined UNESCO, I was in Mexico. I was in charge of I was the executive director of the Mexican National Bioethics Committee. And one of the most important missions that we decided to have for the National Bioethics Committee was really to build a culture of bioethics, meaning that it was not only an issue of issuing advices of what was the right thing to do, but for us it was really very much important that everybody was, because for us bioethics, and that's why I was very happy to join UNESCO, because the vision of UNESCO about bioethics is exactly the same, is that all of the issues that are related to health, to disease, to cure, to suffering and human experiences, and therefore everybody is concerned. And that's why it's not an issue of experts as such, but it is something that is everybody has something to say about. And in particularly if we get into the UN system where we have the human rights framework, it's also something that nobody can be left out of these kind of decisions. Now, of course, the great challenge is how you make sure that everybody is addressed, that everybody understands, that everybody can be engaged to what you have them, what is the purpose of engaging the people. But so what we tried to do in Mexico was that making sure that at least we produced information that people, different audiences could be familiar with what was at stake, particularly when very hot or sensitive discussions were taking place. Now, UNESCO, in a way, continues. That's why I was very happy to participate, to join UNESCO, because the idea of UNESCO is also to make one of them, I mean, as you know, one of the main, because many people are familiar with UNESCO basically because of the heritage places, and many more do not know that UNESCO does much more than protecting cultural places, which is also very important, but is exactly the same principle for sciences, for example. I mean, the reason to establish UNESCO was to foster international collaboration and to build peace and to make sure that we achieve the well-being of people by having international collaboration in science, in education, and in culture. And in that sense, the idea of science, of looking at science, is to link it into a set of values to make sure that these goals are achieved in the framework of the human rights, and in particular also making sure that this is a UN organization. So we are a big variety of countries. So we have, for the moment, 193 countries. So it is very important to make sure that you meet the goals of all the nations, and at the same time you take into account the cultural variety, which is huge. And we heard a little bit in the previous panel, what about, for example, indigenous populations or disabled populations or whatever. So what happened is that in 1993, the Director General of UNESCO established the International Bioethics Committee because he realized that when it was at the time when the whole DNA was the DNA project was finalized, and he realized that it was going to be huge challenges becoming in front of member states, and this technology will bring a lot of revolutions. So the idea of the Director General at the time was to have a body of experts, international experts, in their individual capacities. They are not representing their governments. They are there because in their individual capacities, and the idea is that they are multidisciplinary, and we really try to strike a balance geographically to make sure that we have different ethical positions, different disciplines, and different cultures represented in the committee, trying to kind of simulate what is the real world. And try to have these people to identify what are the challenges that are the most ethical challenges that are arriving at that time, particularly linked with genome edit or with genomics, and then try to advise governments on how to deal with it. Now, after that, in 1998, another committee, the Commission of Ethics of Science and Technology, was established. It's also formed by independent experts. They are trying to address more issues of more general, not only life sciences and medical sciences and that have a direct impact on human health, for example, but also in general in science and technology. Now the boundaries, as you know, are getting a bit more blurred, so there is a lot of more communication among themselves. They have been doing much on, for example, on environmental ethics in the last time, but now they are working also a lot of IoT and artificial intelligence. But also IBC has been also working on latest technologies. So I don't want to get very much to extend too much, but just to say that these committees have been the ones who have been paving the way to another very important role of UNESCO, which is on one hand the laboratory of ideas through the work of these committees, try to find within the diversity some common shared values, which in the framework of UNESCO and particularly in the whole declarations that you can find are, as I said already, human rights, human dignity, justice, equity, solidarity, the right to access to the fruits of science, the non-discrimination, and of course there is also always an issue of risk and benefits. And so these committees try to find within the diversity some principles, and they have been the driving force to the next work of UNESCO, which is standard setting. So UNESCO is the only UN body that has adopted 3 declarations, which are non-legally binding, but nonetheless have been the ones who have paved the way to deliver national and regional legislation related to these topics. So as you can imagine, the first declaration was the one on human genome and human rights in 1997. The second one is the International Declaration on Human Genetic Data in 2003. The last one on this regard was larger. It's the Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights in 2005. And we have another declaration of climate change and a recommendation on scientific researchers. I will speak later about the public engagement in the elaboration of these documents. I just wanted to refer to this. And particularly the recommendations so just one last word, we do the third pillar of the work is capacity building. The idea of having this normative instrument and this laboratory of ideas is that they can have some impact somehow. So all of these are linked to capacity building activities, which are on one hand directed to governments, to the institutional capacity, for example, to establish national bioethics committees. And the other one is more the academic, which is the institutional, which is we have developed, for example, a lot of tools like a core curriculum on bioethics and trainings to teach teachers how to teach bioethics. And we have also developed a lot of tools for national bioethics committees, including how to engage with public and how to develop public policies, which you can have those guidelines online. So what happened after the adoption of the declaration, and this will be my last part, is that the IDC started to write reports to try to flesh out the principles of the declarations, because if you see at the principles of the declarations, they are really shallow. There is the result of what is a UN organization. It's a platform where you can have all the academics try and all the different cultures being together to try to explore what values they can have in common, and at the same time have negotiation about some political principles that they can agree on. So they started to prepare these reports that are also using in the capacity building activities. And in 2015, they developed one on updating the reflection of human genome and human rights. And there, they concretely call upon states and governments to produce internationally legal binding instruments to ban cloning for reproductive purposes. They agree to a moratorium on genomic engineering, at least as long as safety and efficacy of the procedures are not adequately proven as treatments. To renounce to the possibility of acting alone in relation to engineering the human genome, and accept to cooperate on establishing shared global standards for these purposes, building on the principal set of the declarations that I mentioned before, and to encourage to adopt rules, procedures, and solutions which can be as non-controversial as possible, especially with regards to the issue of modifying human genome. Last recommendation, interventions on the human genome should be admitted only for preventive, diagnostic, or therapeutic reasons and without enacting modification for the sentence.
Thank you very much, Daphne. So one of the issues that has come out in all of the comments so far is the question of shared values, of shared principles. We might also say a sort of shared vocabulary or shared starting point. And, you know, I mean, as we've seen, there's a sort of a diversity of what's shared and who it's shared among. So I'd ask Nora to now speak from a particular national perspective, where the Alta made reference to the ways in which the work of her committee was constrained or configured by an existing regulatory landscape in the US and the ways in which it asks questions and so forth, its remit. So I wonder if you'd say something about the German Ethics Council in Germany, its role, the way it sits within the kind of larger landscape of how things are approached in Germany in this sort of domain, but also of its starting points. How are its questions framed, and what does that mean for how you approach those questions, particularly if you compare that approach to approaches taken elsewhere, for example, in this country?
Thank you, and hello. So the German Ethics Council in some way goes back to 2001, when there was a big debate in German society about whether or not to import human embryonic stem cells that had been produced in other countries by destroying embryos. Destruction of embryos for research is illegal in Germany and has been since 1991. But the question arose whether scientists in Germany should still be able to use the cell lines, the embryonic stem cell lines produced elsewhere. And back then, the government created this then called National Ethics Council to discuss this particular question. And Parliament, who weren't quite happy with leaving all the initiative to the government, created a sort of competing council made up by members of Parliament and invited experts. And both these bodies deliberated on this question, and then because the general format of having these broad expert committees discussing bioethical issues had turned out to be quite successful. They both stayed active for several years after that and discussed other bioethical and medical ethical topics. But at some point, the wish arose to give all this bioethical advisory business a more proper democratic foundation. And Parliament then actually created its own separate law to form the German Ethics Council as it is now. And that replaced both the two previous bodies. So in its current form, the German Ethics Council has been working since 2008. And the law quite specifically tells us how we should work. We have 26 expert or otherwise represent members who represent special expertise or interest in bioethical and medical ethical topics. Half of them get nominated by the government, half by Parliament, and our role is to inform politics, to give advice to government and Parliament, to work closely with similar bodies from around the world, and importantly, to further public discourse as well and engage with relevant target audiences. when we embarked on our project on germline editing, that's pretty much what we did. We worked on this for 3 years and had a number of public meetings. Probably, if you count all of them that had some level of public participation, there were 5 or 6 different ones, where we talked about the topic from all sorts of different angles, not just including reproductive issues, but also in a broader context. And then we also had a number of exchanges with various other partner councils and other organizations. In contrast to what the previous speakers have said, there probably has been a lot more focus on the issues that are facing researchers now, in particular the use of human embryos again in the research that is needed to get reproductive genome editing to the level where it would be considered safe if you wanted to go down that route. The other thing, which is probably a bit different about our approach, is that rather than trying to come up with a series of recommendations about what should or shouldn't be done, although we do have some of those as well, is that we spend a significant amount of our energy and efforts to flesh out the questions that people might want to ask along the whole process of getting to potential applications, and on really reflecting on the arguments that people might want to buy into when determining their own positions. Most of this is available online. We've got our executive summary and the graphic that came out for finding your own individual path through these questions available in English on our website, so I won't go into detail. But our hope is really that by identifying these questions more closely and mapping them quite explicitly to both the possible arguments and the ethical concepts that might come into those arguments, the discourse, be it at the public level or at the level of other expert exchanges, could be made a bit more transparent and also help people to find a common language even when backgrounds are very different.
Can I ask you to just elaborate slightly more on specifically, also made reference to the issue of how to, what questions you would need to ask to make it technically responsible. I wonder how those stand in relation to other sorts of questions, ethical questions in your mapping of things, and particularly given that the starting point is protection of human dignity. What does that mean for how you think about technical dimensions and its relationship to other dimensions of this area?
I'm not sure if we answered that question explicitly, because at the technical level, we probably bought into a number of similar conditions that need to be checked and hopefully fulfilled before people progress to a subsequent stage. But what we do is that we very clearly say that those cannot be the only questions asked, but that they always need to be seen in conjunction with these other issues at the societal level, at the determination of general ethical or political positions, and that there need to be certain checkpoints where both or all those dimensions need to be examined before you consider progressing. Thanks.
So Dana, I want to now turn to you, last but not least, to say something about a quite new initiative, a quite new body, the International Commission on Clinical Applications of Germline Editing or something like that, of which you are a member. And I wonder if you would say something about where it came from. What is the sort of sense of the need for this that gave rise to it, and also its focus and the rationale for its focus, given that its focus is quite narrowly technical.
Right. If it's all right, Ben, I will say a little bit about myself and,
please do, absolutely.
Other things that I'm involved in.
Because there's a reason that you're on this committee.
So I want to say first that Alta's an anecdote about Orrin Hatch describes one of the only things he ever did that I agreed with, and he was my senator from Utah. So I am a genome editor, and until I closed my lab last year, I'd worked with all of the platforms, the zinc finger nucleases, the TALENs, and the CRISPR platform. I started working on genome editing almost 24 years ago, before people had really defined what it is. I just have had a ball being in the whole history of this technology and seeing what it's able to do. Ben also mentioned that I have an affiliation with the IGI here in Berkeley. I am the part-time interim director of their society program. What that means is I spend a little bit of time here and I try to help Lee Witkowski any way I can. We're in a process of trying to expand the efforts of the society program in a variety of areas, including policy and public engagement and education. And a couple of the things that I'm particularly interested in are bidirectional conversations between scientists and non-scientists as a way of incorporating broad public opinion into things that are happening both in the policy arena, but also in the research arena. So we're hoping to figure out ways to have impact in those areas. The other thing that I'm quite interested in that there's been a little bit of discussion about in the previous panel is equitable access to the benefits of the technology. And I'm not going to elaborate on that anymore. As part of my lightning campaign to make Alta feel good, I'm going to mention that I was at the Asilomar conference in 1975. I was very young, but I was there. And I think arguably there was public input into policies around recombinant DNA. The conference itself, the Asilomar conference, was attended mostly by scientists and journalists, but it was in response to a lot of public outcry. The public input into the governance of recombinant DNA was chaotic. It wasn't organized in any particular way, but it did have an impact, and particularly because it was really easy for people to imagine horror scenarios for what might happen with released recombinant DNA. And so you may know that Ben probably does, maybe many of you don't, the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts banned recombinant DNA research within its borders for 6 months.
Berkeley was also at the forefront of that.
Berkeley did too. Anyway, we're in a really different situation now with CRISPR and with genome editing. In the early and mid-1970s, we really didn't know what the impact of recombinant DNA would be for research and for applications, medical applications, agricultural applications. Now I think we can say with a lot more certainty both what those applications are going to look like and what the potential hazards are. So just to put that out there. Okay. The International Commission on Clinical Uses of Human Germline Genome Editing. It's a commission that was established last early summer, I think. It has 17 representatives from a lot of different countries around the world. We've had one public meeting. It was in Washington in August. We have another one next month in London, and a final one will be in Washington in January. And at these meetings, we're making progress toward fulfilling our tasks. And let me just read you a couple of things from our statement of task. This is from the National Academies of Sciences and Medicine and the Royal Society, who assembled the commission. An international commission will be convened with the participation of National Academies of Sciences and Medicine throughout the world to develop a framework for considering technical, scientific, medical, regulatory, and ethical requirements for germline genome editing should society conclude that such applications are acceptable. So this is a group that's following on from Alta's group that provided that report in 2017. We're looking in even more depth at what would be the technical conditions in particular that might make human germline editing acceptable. The specifics refer to scientific issues as well as societal and ethical issues where inextricably linked to research and clinical practice that must be evaluated for various classes of possible applications. Identify appropriate protocols for preclinical validation, protocols for assessing and evaluating potential mosaicism and long-term implications, and some things that follow on from there. So what we've done so far has been to get information, testimony. We've had some webinars from experts on the technology, on human genetics. We've had some input from patient advocates. We'll have more technical input on human embryo, our understanding of human embryos. And in the London meeting next month, we'll also have more input from people who are involved in ethics and governance. And actually, we'll share a session with the WHO committee.
There's nobody from WHO on that session. You've got all kinds of random people there.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It's supposed to be a shared session.
I know.
Yeah.
Problem of
Little
representation.
sibling rivalry going on here.
So our involvement of the public has been mostly like what happened with Alta's commission, which is that we invite the public, anybody at all, to watch and listen to our public sessions, to listen to and watch our webinars, to provide comment, but we aren't specifically charged with involving broad ranges of the public in the discussions themselves. But as I said, we have a fairly narrow remit to look at, what standards would have to be met before a public that was comfortable with going ahead with this might think it was safe and effective.
Do you think that remit can be met through expert input? Do you see, or do you have concerns about who you're hearing from or not hearing from? The ways the questions that you have been handed as part of your statement of task are framed?
Yeah. So deciding who we're going to hear from is an ongoing process, and we evaluate it all the way along. We have phone calls with the full commission or subsets of the commission to decide what sorts of input do we need. So what we're doing is we're looking at what's the state of the technology right now, and what are the things that are out there that are going to be developed in the future that are sort of on the horizon. We can see them, albeit in the distance, that would sort of push us toward a situation where we would feel that the technology can do the things that people in the public are hoping and actually thinking that it can do.
Yeah. Though, for instance, some of the questions Gregor brought up in the previous panel are at once technical and also sort of complexly not. Well, what are technically safe interventions into particular diseases? Also connects with the question of how judgments about what are diseases and what are diseases that warrant interventions are made, and what it would mean for those to be safe, given that those can be understood, as he was pointing out, as other kinds of problems, as problems of social context, as opposed to problems of DNA sequence. Are these questions that the Commission is contending with, or are they beyond the remit? Because they are admittedly very difficult questions.
Right. So as Alta's group came up with, and pretty much everybody talks about it in the same way, you have a risk-benefit analysis that you need to do. And depending what the benefits might be, the tolerable risks will be in a different category. So we are dealing with risk-benefit analysis. That hasn't been a big part of the discussion so far. We've been getting much more of the technical input, but it's coming. As I said, we only had one of the 3 public conferences that we are going to have.
Right. But the issue of sort of what counts as a risk, as Daphne was pointing out, you can see that as a risk to the common heritage of humankind, which is a very different way of thinking about risk than risk at the sort of biochemical level to a specific individual. Did you also want to?
Yeah, just very briefly, I wanted to say even more narrowly than that, figuring out how to value the benefits is one that is very different in each regulatory context. I worked at the FDA for a little while, and how do you put a value on a child being able to sleep through the night because an asthma medicine is helping against an extremely remote risk of death? Because you've got 1 million kids that are going to sleep better and do better in school, et cetera. These are things that are very difficult to evaluate, and because it's not apples and apples. And I think that not only is every regulatory agency going to struggle with that, but it's going to vary from country to country. So here, how much value do you place on the ability to have a child who's genetically related to you without the risk of the child having a disease is going to vary depending on how important is it in your country that people have kids that are genetically related to you. So I don't know that any one body could answer this because it's going to be very context specific.
Sure. Laurence, did you want to? No. Let me. Since just in the interest of time, since we have, you guys can all see her waving at me, but I can't really see her. No, in the interest of time, since we have reproduced a problem, not so much a deficiency, but a sort of problem in these kinds of operations, which is the issues are immensely complex and can fill up the time for this small group of people who are commissioned to deal with them, and then there isn't room to bring in other voices. So I want to take a few minutes to bring in some other voices from the audience, and ask if anybody has a question. Jennifer.
I have a question for Alta. Could you give us an update on how many people have registered now their research protocols with the WHO?
So, yeah. So Jennifer asked how many people have now registered their research with the WHO. Right now, we're starting with somatic research, not germline, and WHO already has a clinical trials registry, which is the first step. Finding a way to get people to register research, not clinical, but preclinical research, is the next challenge, and that we're still working on.
Okay.
Other questions? Santiago, did you have a yes?
Yeah. How is meaningful dissent? How is meaningful dissent incorporated into the communities that you're a part of? And are there examples other than, I guess, the chaotic public backlash at Asilomar or before Asilomar, where you could see that kind of playing out in your cases?
Opportunities for dissent. Does anybody want to? Nora, please.
This is the norm in anything the German Ethics Council does. We very rarely have consensus on anything and don't aim to publish just consensus. So we either directly set out, as we have done in this project on germline editing, to fully develop the dissenting paths or opinions and to present the arguments that are in favor or against both. Sometimes we then also include how many people voted for which, but since we're not in the first instance a body who decides something, but just sort of presents the possible paths, that's not the main thing. Sometimes there is almost a consensus, but somebody will still disagree. And for that, we have explicit space for people to present dissenting opinions in their own separate space. And that gets published together with the main opinion.
So I'm just going to, we're not going to put the questions up here because it will continue to blind you all, but they are active. So if you're logging into the Poll Everywhere, it will show you what questions do you have for the panel. And Kevin back there is going to maybe read one, if that's all right.
Yeah, so we have a question from YouTube. So from Alex. And this is a question I hear a lot, and it's kind of difficult asking, and I'm sure the panels hear this a lot too. Do they think that actors in such countries as, and then list a bunch of countries, that there will ever be a way to regulate the use or misuse of CRISPR worldwide, particularly for enhancement? What do you say to the public that asks that a lot?
The challenge of global governance. Maybe, Laurence, do you want to start since you've got the largest number of cats to herd?
Just to acknowledge that it is a challenge, but I think it's also a necessity. personally. The latest developments show the importance of having that reflection. So again, this notion of consensus or agreeing, any steps is important, I think. And it's, I do believe that it's possible to get agreement on a certain number of fundamental principles, and then on the way to go to a decisions, potentially. And I think that the approach of the German Ethics Committee is quite interesting in that respect. If I may take this opportunity to make a comment, I actually have a questions to the panel to a certain point. I'm struck by the idea, and you have in the title of this seminar, CRISPR consensus with a question mark. And I think that there's one area where there seems to be consensus, is the need for public debate. There's none, we heard that it's subject to the society deciding and so on. So this agreement on public debate is necessary. I have two questions on this. Are we all talking about the same things when we talk about public debate? I have a lot of doubt on this. I have a lot of doubt in two respects: the question to answer and the modality to it. And the second element is, and in here I can also address the questions to myself. There's a lot of things going on technology, technical aspects, we've heard that, and it's always subject to. But what about these articulations between the work that is done on these technical aspects and safety aspect, and actually the public opinions collections? And how do we reconcile this? How do you articulate both? Because there seems to be going quite fast on safety, risk, technology. But are there going to be a possibility to wait for public opinion afterwards, because it seems to be the key element at the end, or not? I'm sorry to put it that way, but I think that's quite important, an important issue here.
I think those are absolutely excellent and crucial questions. And actually, I'd like to close the panel by inviting everyone to respond to those questions, not in the fullness of the responses you could give, but by pointing to, in your experience in working in these contexts, what is a key limitation, incapacity, need that you feel it needs addressing, particularly vis-a-vis the role of public debate and the relationship between processes of technical judgment and larger questions that in effect belong to all of us. Maybe we'll just go down the line, beginning with Alta.
I think in an area in which a lot of the publicly expressed concerns have to do with questions of morality and religion and cultural values, that it's important in every country and every jurisdiction to really think hard about what is the role of those attitudes in terms of governance. Are those sufficient reasons to prevent individuals from acting in a way that's contrary to those larger, more commonly shared values? That problem of majoritarianism, but also wanting to protect the interests of dissenters, runs in every country, and it's handled differently in every country. And I think that role of what does public opinion really mean in your governance system, I think is crucial.
Laurence.
Well, that's a big question. That's really a challenge. I think there are multiple aspects that are really challenging, even at the regional level, that is Europe. But I also think that there's an issue of autonomy in the sense of recognizing the ability and the value of the view of others as a key element, and you can extrapolate that on many different levels. And responsibility. Responsibility to be honest, transparent, and objective as much as possible. And there are shared responsibility. I think we were asking at the beginning who is an expert, who's not an expert. I think I agree with the question of what does expert mean. I think we could all have different hats, but we have to be clear when we express ourselves which hat we are wearing to voice our concerns, and that's quite important. So transparency, responsibility, respect of others.
Nora.
Including economy.
I agree with all of that. I do think there always is a challenge and will be throughout the next steps of this particular discourse to really think about how all these different initiatives and approaches to public discourse are going to enter the process at the decision level making. And I don't have a blanket answer to it, nor do I think there can be one. But I think it's important that it happens at some level. So not that these processes just happen and people can check the box and say, oh, we've done some discourse, now let's carry on with our usual processes, but that there is some reflection on how this is going to be taken into account. I think there have been instances in the past where this has worked. I think the UK's process in permitting mitochondrial replacement therapies wasn't a bad way to go about this, but it was a very specific question. And for genome editing, we are at a much earlier and broader stage. So it will be interesting to see how it pans out.
I agree with those comments. From a practical point of view, I think it's quite difficult to get a broad range of informed public input. And I've had a few experiences where I've gone into fairly small groups of people, very little scientific background, and tried to give them a little primer on what we're capable of doing, what we're not capable of doing, as a prelude to getting feedback from them, how they feel about it. And I think, the GMO example is a good one where without solid information on what was actually happening with these modified crops, there were very loud voices that dominated the conversation. And what I'd rather see happen is a lot of different voices that have a better idea of what's actually underlying the research and the applications that are going on, have a chance to chime in. And I've also, in these opportunities I've had to answer the question asked earlier, tried to elicit dissent, and found that the sort of dominant attitude of people is, if you've got a medical approach that can help my family, why aren't you doing it? And so I think we need to also be trying to put the brakes on some of the exaggerated expectations that the public now has.
Thank you. All right, Daphne, you've been very patient, so you can have the last word.
Thank you so much. In fact, it's very complicated because many of the things have been said. So probably what I would add is that is the sum of what I think we are facing a very crucial, a very difficult challenge. First of all, the technology is very uncertain and it's evolving very quickly. And we were all discussing CRISPR-Cas9, and now we have the new one, which is supposed to be even better. And so maybe you would change the title of the symposium. Second, we really don't know what's I also agree with who is the public, who is the expert. What are the questions? Who decides? But what is knowledge to begin with? Because I don't think the experts, the academicians or the scientists are the only ones who have knowledge. They have a kind of knowledge that other people do not have. But there's knowledge everywhere, and that's part of what we need to do. I think, in my view, since we are also dealing with these technologies that are rapidly changing, it is exactly now the time that we have to start to engage early with the public, because also the public idea is what drives where the research goes. And I agree that one of the main challenges also is not only to decide who is the public, what are we going to ask them, but also what the last comment, it was very important. Not everybody is at the same level of understanding what is at stake, but it is also, I believe, an obligation that we have at all the different levels to inform people and to enable them to participate in the debate, to at least have a saying or to understand what is at stake. Because as we said at the beginning, everybody is and will be affected by it, and it's not an issue of language. It's not only about it's not only, even the risk and benefits are not only an issue between countries, but within countries as well. Don't forget the indigenous populations or odd people, or don't forget about even cultural codes where you cannot have in some regions of the world. It's not correct to contradict your superior or somebody that's elder than you. Or in others that community consultations are taken place, but without women. So there are so many things that we have to, but I think it's part of the challenge that we have to take it on board, and we all have to do it from now. For me, it's really important not to disconnect, because I think we have also living in a world where now that society and research or science, they are not so disconnected. They should not be. We are now even speaking about science, society science. So we really need to be. But I recognize all the caveats and all the difficulties. But I think it's part of the challenge that we have to start discussing now. I mean, including in all the discussions of the governance that we are carrying on. And I also fully agree with the last comment about trying to lower the expectation of the public, because it's also part of what is making them very nervous. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daphne. So before I close out the panel, a couple of points of order, although maybe Lee is going to say these things. Or you're going to handle the lunch tables. Okay. So in that case, my role is finished, and let me invite us to thank this panel for a wonderful discussion.